So I'm trying to both project my presentation and record on the same computer. So we're going to see how it goes. I need to stay here. So if you see me starting to wander like I like to do when I'm talking, please yell at me and tell me to come back here so that I can be talking to the people on here as well as the room. And then hopefully those of you who are watching online can see the screen behind me because I couldn't figure out how to share my screen to hear and on Zoom at the same time. So we'll figure it out.
Whatever all that means.
Yes, trying to make it happen. We'll see if it happens. You can check online later to see how I did. So this is our Advent Adult Forum. It's going to last for 4 weeks. And yes, that does include the 24th in the morning when we have Advent 4 in the morning. And then in the afternoon and evening, we will have Christmas Eve. So it will be a really big day. But I hope that this is a good enough class that you will be drawn back even to spend the entire day with me on the 24th. So as Bob teased in his announcements the last couple of weeks, this class is called My Will Be Done. And if you think that we're talking about me, the teacher, then we'll see how we feel about that later. But the subtitle for this is Preparing for the Coming with the Prophet Isaiah. Most years in the cycle of readings that we read in our worship service called the lectionary, the Old Testament reading for the week is from the prophet Isaiah pretty much every week during the Advent season. In fact, some scholars have called Isaiah the fifth gospel because it is so heavily quoted in the Gospels. It was so heavily quoted by Jesus, other than the Psalms, which of course are, huge and vast and were songs that people sang. And so people had them in their heads, just like Bob's songs that he sang this morning. Other than the Psalms, Isaiah is the most commonly quoted by Jesus himself from the mouth of Jesus. So Isaiah is very important for us, even as Christians, to understanding who God is and what God is doing in this time of preparation for Christmas. So most of the weeks that we get together, we're going to do a lot more discussion and we're looking at some of the passages. Next week, we're going to look at Isaiah chapter 40, which is the most famous passage, I would say, in Isaiah. If you know anything about Isaiah, then you probably are familiar with chapter 40, Comfort, oh comfort my people, says your God. But to get started this week, I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to the book of Isaiah. But before we get there, we need to talk about something else first. We need to talk about prophets, because Isaiah is a prophet. He's one of the most important prophets. He's not the only prophet. But we in modern day America, I don't think completely understand what a biblical prophet is about. When we think about prophecy, we think about fortune tellers at the county fair, those types of things. We think about what was the name of the one that was in the arcade box in Big, where Tom Hanks's little character goes and puts the money in and telling your fortune, or you go into the tent and it's all hot and sweaty and she gets out her crystal ball and tells you your fortune. Zotar, yes, that's right, Zoltar. So that's the kind of image that we tend to have in our culture today. I think when we talk about prophecy, we're talking about telling the future and all those types of things. But prophets in the Bible are very different, and how we understand prophets and prophecy and the purpose of it really impacts our understanding of what Isaiah is about and what we should try to get out of it. So this is going to be perhaps a little bit of a jarring presentation for you today, but I hope that you'll take some time to think about it. I am very open to questions and disagreements, but I want to start here so that you all understand at least where I'm coming from when I talk about Isaiah as a prophet. So what is a prophet? The first prophet was the prophet Samuel, who was also the last judge from the line of the judges. And we're going to talk a little bit about the history here in just a minute. But Samuel was kind of the transition from the idea of a judge into the idea of a prophet. And Samuel's job as the first prophet was to anoint the kings. He anointed Saul and David. He was also responsible for declaring holy war. The king was not allowed to declare war in the name of God. It had to be declared by the prophet. To interpret the tradition for application to contemporary issues. So the purpose of the prophet from the very beginning was to help people understand what is happening in light of who we know God to be based on our scriptures, based on our traditions. And this is the most important piece of this that we're going to talk a lot about today. So as time went forward from Samuel, we get into the period of the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel. And during this time, there were three different kind of job descriptions, three different roles that were held by different people. We had the prophet, like Samuel or Elijah or Isaiah. We had the priest, whose job it was to be in the temple doing the rituals related to the temple and related to the law. And then we had the king, who ideally was supposed to be doing God's will in the political realm, but often that didn't happen. And so the prophet was there to continually remind the king, hey, you are a special kind of king. You're not really the one in charge here. God is in charge, and you are just kind of, the hands and voice of that in the world. And sometimes that worked. Like in the case of Josiah, who was reminded of this, and then he had all these different reforms. But a lot of times that didn't work because, of course, the king wanted to do what the king wanted to do and not necessarily what God wanted to do. And so then the prophet's job was to keep reminding and telling the king things that he didn't want to hear, and therefore getting himself into quite a bit of trouble. As the social conditions, as the political conditions of the kingdom of Israel changed, so did the role of the prophet. So sometimes you have a sense that the prophet's message is focusing more toward the Exodus tradition, speaking about God's acts on behalf of the people, how God has worked for us. And so you can think about, if the people are going through a time when they are being oppressed, when they are in a place where their daily lives are disrupted and they're experiencing a lot of stress as a people, then you want that kind of reminder of who God is. Remember, in the traditions, we are told that we are God's special people. God chose us. God rescued us from slavery in Egypt and brought us out of that land. And so we can trust, even in the face of these current situations that we find ourselves in, we can trust that God's going to be there for us here too, and God is going to deliver us again, because God has already made that promise to us. But then there are other times when the people are doing fairly well, and they need a different kind of message. They don't need to hear that God is going to save them because they don't feel like they have anything to be saved from. And so instead, you get more of the David tradition. You get prophets speaking about the judgment of God. Yes, God protects you from outside forces that are potentially threatening, but within the city of God, within God's protection, there is also some level of danger, because you are safe in God's city. You are safe with God's protection, but you're never safe from the ruler of the city. You're never safe from the wrath of God, the one that's protecting you, if you aren't living the way that God asks you to live, if you aren't living with God's justice and mercy. And so, depending on those circumstances, depending on where the people sat, the message looks very different, but the purpose remains the same, which is to interpret the tradition of the people, the scriptures, for applying it to understand what is happening in the world and why we're in relation to God. Any questions about that? Clear as mud. All right. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a phrase that I learned in seminary. It is fourth telling rather than foretelling. So when we think about prophets, when we think about, this whole concept of prophecy and apocalyptic writing, we think about the fortune telling thing. We think about that person that can look into your eyes or read your palm and tell you what's going to happen in the future. But that is not what is going on with the prophets in the Bible. The prophets are not there to tell you what is going to happen in the distant future or even in near future. The prophets are there to foretell, to tell forth the news of God, to interpret for you what God is up to in the world right now, in light of what's happening around us and in light of what we already know about who God is and who we are. So the role of the prophet is to interpret current events. You might notice that what I'm saying to you right now is very similar to what happens in the sermon on any given Sunday morning. Rightly done, one of the roles of the preacher is hopefully to be open to God's prophetic message, to share with the congregation and with the community how they understand what God is doing in contemporary events. And a lot of times we don't want to hear it, right? Because it's hard. We don't want to know that God is moving in a particular direction because then we have to do something about it and we don't want to do it. Pastors who do it right get themselves into a lot of trouble, but that's not anything new because we have all these prophets, even in our own scriptures, that are constantly getting themselves into trouble, having to flee in the face of the king's wrath because they are there to tell the king the truth about God. And nobody wants to hear that. That's hard. It's a very difficult job. Nobody ever really wants it. Very rarely does God say, hey, I'm calling you as a prophet. And the story says that the guy says, oh yeah, of course, that's wonderful. I'm happy to do that. Most of the time it's, no, I can't do that because blah, 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 excuse. Gus.
How do you distinguish between prophets and false prophets?
Ah, good question. So really, you can't. The only thing you can do is wait until things unfold. And then if the thing that they said, if the way that they're interpreting events seems to make sense and continue to make sense, then you can say, yes, this makes sense. And then if it doesn't go that way, then they were probably a false prophet. But because we now today have access to the scriptures for ourselves, we can also do our own checking. Nowadays, do your own research is a very popular phrase that I tend to make fun of, but we can do that, right? You don't have to just listen to somebody tell you what they think is going on in the world and just take what they have to say at face value. You can go yourself and you can look in the scriptures and you can think about these things and you can talk to other people and you can ask for other opinions on the issue and see if what the person is saying fits into your understanding of who God is, who God has been, and the trajectory of what you believe is going on in the world.
I think of a phrase that I learned in seminary, that Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And you think there's something to be said for a prophet, judging a prophet by that message as well. If a prophet tells me what I want to hear, what I expect to hear, or if I am having a very difficult time and the prophet tells me that I deserve my very difficult time by keeping more onto me, is there something to be said for true or false prophecy addressing those conditions? I
think so. For those online, Bob suggested that we can use one of the measuring sticks we can use is that Jesus came to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so if that's not what's happening, then we can kind of judge it based on that. And I think there's some level of truth in that, in terms of if we're hearing what we want to hear, why would God waste that kind of time? God has a lot to do. So if I'm very confident that I know what God is doing in this world and I'm right, why is God going to send somebody to me to verify that? But if I'm hearing messages that, oh gosh, that really prickles me, let me stop for a minute, and instead of just getting angry or immediately defending myself, let me rest with that for a minute. Let me think about, why is this making me so angry? And maybe it's because this person is saying something that I know deep in my gut to not be true about who God is. If the person comes to me and says, God is okay with all of those children in Yemen starving to death, that makes me angry. Why does that make me angry? Because Jesus said, let the little children come to me. That can't possibly be true. But if the person comes to me and says, the fact that you're sitting there with a full belly while there are children in Yemen starving, that God is not pleased with that. That makes me angry too. But why is that making me angry? Because I know that is true and I don't want to admit it, because if I admit it, then I either have to live with that tension or I have to do something about it. And I don't really want to do either of those things. I'd rather just ignore it.
Sorry, I don't want to take up everything, but I'm taking up this. It makes me wonder if the idea of a prophet is not so narrow or delineated as we sometimes want it to be. I think about spending, I spent 3 months in an oncology ward as the chaplain intern. And over again, more than anything else, when I talk with people, the question came around to, did I deserve this? Or what did I do to deserve this? And I wonder if when we hear things like that, regardless of where it is, I only mention it because that's where I had my own kind of like bulwark. Telling people about who God is can in itself be an act of prophecy. That there doesn't need to be, somebody dressed like Elijah or Gandalf, or whatever a prophet is supposed to look like. I know Gandalf's not, but he has an impressive outfit. I wonder if prophecy is something that is wider and deeper and involves us, instead of talking about that person, are they a prophet, but about what work do we do that can also be prophecy.
Yeah, I think we all have a prophetic voice. I think that we want to understand what's happening to us, right? We want to feel in control of our world, even if the circumstances that we find ourselves in are not what we like, what we want. We want to be able to understand why, because if we understand why, then we can control it better. We can cease doing that thing so that the cancer will go away. And most of the time, of course, we ask these questions in times of struggle and difficulty. Nobody asks, why is this happening to me, when they just won the lottery, because that's just how we're made up. Joan, did you have something?
I was just thinking that there are two types of prophets. Not all prophets are prophesizing what God wants. Jim Jones, yeah.
Yep.
Big prophets.
Yeah.
There are good ones and there are bad ones. We need the discernment to.
Yes. And the more we practice, the better we get at it, right?
Right.
The more we understand who God is, the more we study together, the more we disagree with each other and challenge each other in our understanding of who God is and who we are, the better we get at making sense of our world in light of who God is and who we are. It's a hard thing to do.
So true prophets, they don't declare themselves prophets. There's something that happens that to them that people see them as prophets, like Jim Jones declared himself as a prophet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can just go out and say, today I'm a prophet and everything I say is God's word. I think that God gives us all words of prophecy, and we can all have prophetic voices in our world if we have the gumption to bring it up. But again, I think it takes a lot of discernment. Again, very rarely do our biblical prophets say, yeah, God, I'm gonna take this message that you're giving me and go and tell the king that he's messing up and that he's got to change his ways or else. Nobody wants to be the person to bring that message, because guess what? They definitely like to shoot the messenger in this time and place. Well, not shoot, because they don't have, never mind. But if we feel that call, if we have that message and we feel that call, and even though we know that it's going to get us into trouble and it's going to cause us pain and problems, and it's going to change our lives in ways that we aren't sure we even want, if we are willing to open our mouths and open our hearts and live the thing that we're saying, then all of us, I think, are prophets in that way. But again, we have to make sure that it's God's message and not our own. It depended on who they were. They had some scriptures, but not the obviously not the nice little package that we have today. They had scrolls of, depending on who we're talking about. Samuel, as a very, very early prophet, would have had many fewer resources available to him versus one of the much later prophets, like an Isaiah or a Habakkuk or one of those, would have had some others of the scriptures available to them. But usually just like the first 5 books of what we can today consider our Bible is kind of where most of them would have landed, if they had any at all. Gus?
So we have to use discernment to determine if somebody is really prophetic or not. Isn't it almost dangerous to talk about Isaiah the prophet?
Yeah. So Gus is asking, is it dangerous to even talk about any of these guys as prophets? And so in our tradition, the Lutheran tradition, the Protestant tradition, we understand history, tradition, as a source of confirmation of the legitimacy of something. It's not the same, it doesn't rise to the same level as the Bible in terms of authority over us, but it makes sense to think about. So this guy, Isaiah, lived millennia ago, and he's still around, and we still take what he has to say seriously. And all these people from then to now, even in all their different circumstances and all of their different situations and all the different places around the world that they've lived, all of them have found God's truth in his words. And so that kind of helps to solidify. So like when you first asked me about how do you determine between true and false prophets, and I just kind of flippantly said, you wait. And in some ways, that's true, because the longer you wait and the more you can come back around and around and around to that same message, the more that confirms for us the legitimacy of that particular prophet. The problem being, of course, that if Bob stands up right now and tells us that he's a prophet and that he has a message from God, it's happening right now. And so how do we know if what he's saying is from God or not? And that's when you have to look back at the other traditions. Is this in line with what Isaiah said? Is this in line with what Jesus said? Is this in line with what we believe to be true about God from a historical tradition, from a biblical understanding? And then we can discern together. One of the big things that comes out of the Reformation is the idea that we all have the capacity to think about these things, to talk about these things, to discern these things together. We don't have to have one person telling us what God wants and who God is. We all are part of that conversation. And so we can't do it by ourselves. We have to be in conversation with each other.
Is this a time to mention court prophets, or do you want to do that another time?
Let's not talk about that today. We're talking generally about prophecy today. So does everybody kind of understand where we are here? This is very difficult. Most of the things I bring to you are very difficult. There's never a clear answer, but I think, to me, if there's an immediate clear answer, then that gives me pause, because that's not how God works. I was just sitting, where was I? It might have even just been just now in the service, or maybe it was yesterday, but I was thinking about faith. Oh, it was in the, while we were listening to the Isaiah reading today. And it was, tear down the heavens and come, and we're waiting for Jesus to come back. You talked about in your children's message. And once again, I came around to that question of, God, why don't you just make it more clear to people what it is that you're doing in the world? It's so hard for us to try to figure it out, even though we want to, let alone all those other people out there who, reject this. Why don't you just actually tear open the heavens and start booming voices all across the world and saying, I am God, this is how it is. Then everybody would know what to do. Everybody would believe. But doing that completely takes away our free will, right? Because even if you don't want to believe, even if all you are is terrified, you're terrified. And so you're gonna, duck and cover if you hear some booming voice. And so God gives us that distance, gives us that space, gives us that grace to work through all of these things not on our own, but to come to what we want to do and who we want to be with God's help, but not kind of shoving it down our throats. And I think that's a huge gift in itself. Jesus could have come and did everything that Jesus did, and then after dying, jumped out of the grave and said, "Hi, everybody," like Grover. But he didn't. He appeared to certain people so that message could be shared, and so that we still had that free will. We still had that ability to be part of the story, not just in terms of being able to share the message, but also in discerning what that message actually is. And that's huge. We are pieces of dirty toilet paper, and God chooses to partner with us. It does say that. We have a very sanitized version of the Bible here in English. All right, anything else here? I want to run through a little bit more with you before we go. No, I said Jesus didn't jump out of the grave like Grover and say,
Yeah.
Did Grover
jump out of a grave?
no, but he said, "Hello, everybody."
Okay.
That was like his catchphrase.
Oh.
Hello, everybody. Okay. So, going now into Isaiah specifically, the reason why it was important for us to talk about what a prophet is because I'm also going to share with you that I don't think that the book of Isaiah was written in its entirety by a guy named Isaiah. And the reason for that is because if a prophet's job is to look at current events and interpret them in light of who God is and who we are and what they believe God is doing in the world in that line of how God has been operating before, then that person needs to be speaking to a particular context. And in the book of Isaiah, there are 3 different contexts that are several hundred years apart from each other. And so if you believe that a prophet's job is to tell the future with his crystal ball, then that's not a problem for you, because you can just say, oh, well, this Isaiah guy sat there with his crystal ball and he looked into the future and he said, this is what's going to come, and this is what's going to come next, and this is what's going to come next. But if you believe that the job of a prophet has nothing to do with telling the future and everything to do with interpreting what's happening now and helping the people to discern how they should be living right now, if they will listen to him, then we have to understand that the book of Isaiah was actually written at 3 different times by at least 3 different people, probably more. And I don't think it matters at the end of the day if you can go there with me. I think if you want to continue to sit with the idea of the one guy who got all of these messages and put them together, that's fine. But I don't want you to stop there, because I think that kind of misses the point. Because again, it's not about, ooh, this person knows what's going to happen next. It's about, why is this the message? What is God trying to tell us within this context? So whether we got the message from one guy at one point for all these times to hear about, or whether we got the message from several different people over the course of time, is kind of irrelevant to me. But what matters to me is that we understand that there are at least 3 different contexts that we need to look at to understand and be able to read Isaiah, so that we can figure out, why is this being written? To whom is it being written? And then how can we translate that into our own time and place? Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So I want to just give you kind of a really quick sweeping history of what's going on with the prophet Isaiah. So as I mentioned before, Samuel was the very first prophet. He represented the transition from the time of the judges, when the people of Israel were broken up into these tribes. We had the 12 tribes. They were more or less independent of each other. They would kind of create alliances, and then those alliances would break up, and then they'd create other alliances, and all that kind of thing. And this is throughout the book of Judges. So we've got judges that you'll recognize, like Gideon and Samson and Deborah. This is the period that we're talking about here, that there were these different smaller leaders that would lead one or a small alliance of these tribes in understanding what God wants them to do and who they are. So that's our map up here of the, I know you can't read this, but all the different colors are all the tribes. Then when we get to Saul, and then we get to David, and this is where all of those tribes coalesce into one united kingdom or united monarchy, because I don't want you to think I'm talking about Great Britain. So I just saw that and thought, no, this is not about the United Kingdom. This is about the United Kingdom. So this is the kingdom of Israel. For the most part, it was ruled by David and then his son Solomon. And this took place in approximately the years 1000 to 900 BCE. And I use BCE because BCE means before the Common Era, or the year 0. We, in scholarship, we don't use BC and AD because they're not as particular in terms of identifying when things happened. And so we use BCE when we're talking about scholarship, so that we know what we're talking about, and then we can compare that to other things that are happening in other parts of the world. So David and Solomon are ruling in approximately the year 1000 to 900 BCE. Now, during this time, there were still prophets. We had the prophet Nathan, who was constantly telling even David, who, was the apple of God's eye, what he was doing wrong and how he wasn't doing the right thing, and how God's message for him was different than what he thought it might be. But then after Solomon, there was a lot of upheaval in terms of who was going to be in charge next. Solomon's son became the king, but it ended up that the kingdom was split in half, and the kingdom of Israel to the north took 10 of the tribes and went north, and all that was left was the kingdom of Judah in the south. And the kingdom of Judah had Jerusalem, which was the major city, the royal city, and then also the city where the temple resided. So it was the city of God, and it was the city of the king. So they still had a lot of power, but the kingdom of Israel broke off. There were lots of wars and killing and things like that. But most of what we have in our Bible, the stories come out of the traditions of Judah. We do have some stories about Israel, some prophets in Israel. We have stories about who the kings were in Israel, but the perspective of who's right and who's wrong is mostly out of Judah. And just as an aside, this is also where we get the idea of Samaritans as evil, because the Samaritans are the ones from the kingdom of Israel.
You can see the capital, that star that's in the middle. It's hard to read, but no, the upper one.
Oh yeah, Samaria.
It says Samaria next to it. It's very difficult to read, but the capital of Israel was Samaria.
And that's why they're called Samaritans.
Can I also put one more thing?
Yes.
Also, just as an aside, so you do not confuse current events with past events, you'll notice that none of these maps that show Israel or its constitutive states is equal to or matches the borders of the current state of Israel.
Yes. Current events politically have nothing to do with the
Yes.
the borders of these.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to make sure we weren't going to move in a political direction because that is not.
Yeah, that's not what's happening
That's
here.
not what's going on.
So some of the kings during this period that you might recognize: Josiah, Ahaz, Zechariah. We have the good kings and the bad kings, and the ones who listen to God and the God's prophets, and the ones that don't listen to God and God's prophets, and the ones who try to kill God's prophets. And this period took place between approximately 900 and 720 BCE. Everybody still with me? Okay. So now we reach the prophet Isaiah. Finally, there he is, Mr. Isaiah.
Really captures the halo we want.
And even though he did public ministry for at least probably somewhere in the range of 60, 64 years, he always, of course, had that gray beard, because, you know, that's what prophets look like, right? Like Gandalf, they have to have the beard and the robes, and he doesn't have the hat, though. Not, at least not in this picture. Maybe he took it off for his photograph. I don't know.
You couldn't see the halo.
Yeah. So we know from the beginning of the book of Isaiah that Isaiah was called by God by having visions of the temple. We've got the image of the hot coals touching his lips to clean him and make him ready to be the prophet. We've got the images of the angels with all the wings and
Isaiah chapter 6.
yeah, and scary stuff, and do not be afraid, and whom shall I send, and who shall we send, and who will go for us? Here I am, send me. This is Isaiah. He did his public ministry for potentially 64 years. That's a long time. And that's not just his lifespan, that's him actually being in public ministry. Imagine spending 64 years having to tell everybody that you meet what they're doing wrong and how God is displeased with them and what they need to do to change. I don't think people are going to invite you to their Christmas party very often if you're that person. But Isaiah's ministry was approximately 740 to 686 BCE. Now you'll notice that 740, because we're going backwards since we're in the BCEs, is about 20 years before I told you the end of that divided kingdom period was. That ended in 720. So you can kind of see what's going on there. So Isaiah, so to speak, saw the writing on the wall. I put that in quotation marks because that image comes from the book of Daniel, which is also kind of wrapped up in all of this. And he was warning Judah, that southern kingdom, that they would share the fate of Israel if they didn't shape up in the eyes of God. Now, what was that fate of Israel? Well, what happened to Israel in the year 720, which is when the United Kingdom fell, was in 720, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and all the people who lived in Samaria and that northern area were taken into exile into the Assyrian Empire. This was standard tradition, standard practice at the time. When you conquered people, in order to destabilize them, you would take all the people who could potentially revolt against you and you moved them somewhere so that they were destabilized. So not every single person was taken away, but anybody who could claim to be the king, anybody who was in the royal court, anybody who served in a religious leadership role, anything like that was taken away and dumped somewhere else, where they would not have had that kind of power over the people in their area, and therefore they couldn't lead any kind of revolts. So it helped to keep things peaceful in the empire, and it also helped to homogenize the empire so that they didn't have different groups of people all over the place trying to make trouble for them. So at this point now, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, is completely wiped out, off the map, gone as far as history and politics are concerned. And this portion of the story you can find in 2 Kings, if you can tolerate the endless lists of this bad king and this good king and all that kind of thing.
Is this where we get the phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel?
Yes, thank you for that. So as I said before, the northern kingdom was made up of the 10 tribes and the southern kingdom was only 2. And so this is the 10 lost tribes of Israel, because those 10 tribes were disseminated into the Assyrian Empire and in some ways were never heard from again, which is not completely true, but you know, we have mythologies
It
out
makes
there.
for a good story.
It does. So this period took from 720 to 587. Now you notice that we're up to 587, and I told you that Isaiah's ministry was until about 686. So we are 100 years past the end of Isaiah's ministry at this point. But like I said, it's possible that he got all of this stuff, you know, way ahead of time from God and shared the story. I have no problem with that. Doesn't bother me at all. But I want to talk to you about first Isaiah, the section of Isaiah that comes out of this period that I just talked to you about. So this is the period where we've got the divided kingdom, we've got the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, who are sometimes doing God's will and sometimes not doing God's will, most of the time not doing God's will. And so there are prophets who come through and try to set them on the right path. And this encompasses chapters 1 through chapter 39 of the book of Isaiah. Between chapters 1 and 39, we've got some themes that are pretty standard. We've got reminders that God has historically been faithful to the people of Israel and Judah, but also reminders that the people themselves have historically been incredibly unfaithful to God. In fact, the book of Judges is an entire cycle. Every time you have a new story, it's God is faithful to the people sin against God, God gives them over to their sins and they get into a lot of trouble. And then they cry out, God, why have you abandoned us? And then God gives them a judge to help them to get back on the right track. And then they get back on the right track and everybody's happy again. And then they do the whole thing over again and over again and over again. And we're still doing the same thing today. Nothing changes. And so during this period, we have the message is mostly about the coming judgment, but that there's also hope for the future. So we get those messages of, hey guys, you know, we're watching as our northern neighbors get conquered and taken off into exile, and they lose everything and they lose their identity and it doesn't seem like God is with them anymore. If we don't figure out what's going on here and what it is that God wants from us and how we can be in right relationship with God, the same thing is going to happen to us. You can you don't need a crystal ball to tell that, right? You can look around and you can say, hey, maybe we should learn from this situation. But unfortunately, the people didn't do that. And so then, I did put some examples here. So this is chapter 1 of Isaiah, and I want to read this to you. This is an example of the kind of thing that you're going to find in those first 39 chapters of Isaiah that kind of speaks to that period of unrest, fear of these, huge empires outside of ourselves that are threatening us, but then also trying to figure out where is God in all of this. And so Isaiah says, "Hear, O heavens, and listen, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, offspring who do evil, children who deal corruptly, who have forsaken the Lord, who have despised the Holy One of Israel, who are utterly estranged. Why do you seek further beatings? Why do you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and bleeding wounds. They have not been drained or bound up or softened with oil. Your country lies desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. In your very presence, aliens devour your land. It is desolate as overthrown by foreigners. And daughter Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a shelter in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah." So this is the message And this is what happened. The people of Judah even were conquered in the year 587, 586 BCE by the Babylonians. And they too were taken into exile, this time to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar, who I'm sure you've heard of. Yes,
Ask a dumb question.
no dumb questions.
So wait for this. So we have the 10 families, and that's where the Israelites,
Yes.
and the Judah is where the north and the southern,
Mhm.
and it was the two families.
Yes.
Where did the Palestinians fit in?
The Palestinians are not part of the Israelites. Yeah.
Either one.
No.
If you recall, a few maps ago, there was, you could see Israel and Judah, and then there were a few strips off to the side on the edge of the sea that were not, yeah. And so that includes Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod. That's where the Palestinians are considered to be the descendants of the Philistines, the sea peoples, people who arrived by the sea, set up their civilization along the water there. And that was part of why I mentioned that we shouldn't confuse the boundaries of modern Israel with the reality of ancient Israel and Judah.
Yes. You do note, though, that even with the completely separated political circumstances of the late 1940s, when the current state of Israel was established, that map, while not completely recognizable, if you know enough about what's going on, you can see that we've got some indication here of, we've got the Gaza Strip here represented. And so could be a whole conversation for another day about how the Bible and the history that we find in the Bible has influenced the political situation in Israel, but that's not for today. Definitely not. That's okay. That's
No,
okay.
that was a great question.
Yeah. Okay, so back to 2,500 years ago. So we've got Judah now conquered by the Babylonians. Their leaders are taken into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon. He is attempting to turn them into Babylonians, take away all their culture. They have no access to their temple because it's been destroyed. They have no access to their land, which they believe that God gave them as a gift to their ancestor Abraham, and even to the people before that, with Moses and the Israelites getting out of Egypt. And now all they really have is their tradition, their book. And so this is when the Jews become people of the law, people of the book. What makes me different isn't where I live, isn't where I worship. It's the decisions that I make about how I'm going to behave myself, what I'm going to do, what I'm going to eat, what I'm going to wear, how I'm going to clean myself, all of these things. So that's why all of these things are so important to Jews today, even, because that's what makes you a Jew from the perspective of these people at this time. Because you can't say what makes me a Jew is that I live in Judah. There is no more Judah. You can't say what makes me a Jew is that I worship in the temple that God established for me, because it's gone. It's destroyed. What makes me a Jew is that I'm under the kings that are descended from David. Well, Nebuchadnezzar murdered all of the sons of the current king at the time that he conquered the land, and then he tore the eyes out of the current king and took him into exile, knowing that he had no heirs, that there was no more line of David. And so all of those things are gone. So what do? You either give up and become a Babylonian, or you do what the Jews did, which is say, we are people of God. We still believe that God is with us, and we're going to show that to the world and remind ourselves of that by following the law that we find in our books.
Isn't that kind of what we do nowadays? We're really just by our actions.
Just-
Not by what church.
In theory.
Theoretically, yeah. So here you can get stories that are set in this context from 2 Kings and also from the book of Daniel, and Esther is a really good example of this and what it looks like to be a Jew in exile. And this is the period between the years 587 and 539 BCE. You can tell that things are getting a little bit more historical because we have exact years rather than approximate years or rounded years. Any questions up to this point? Okay, so this is a whole new situation for the Jews to be in, right? Before first Isaiah, the original Isaiah, probably the guy who actually had the name Isaiah and did not actually look like that picture, but was represented by that picture, was talking about what is going to happen to you. Your life is fairly good right now. You've got these warring factions around you attempting to come in and steal your land, but right now you've got your own property. You're doing okay, but beware, because look at what just happened to the north. God is not going to protect you if you're not doing what God wants you to do. Now we're in a whole different situation. The people are in exile. They've lost everything. People are dead. Their houses are burned down. They don't have their land. They don't have any comfort anymore. And so this is where we come to chapters 40 to 55, a whole new atmosphere, a whole new tone that we get, and new themes. The theme that judgment is over. The promise of hope is still there for us. Remember that God is in charge of everything. We might think that a king like Nebuchadnezzar is completely authoritative and has all the power in the world. But remember that God is in control even of that guy. God has this under control. God knows what's happening. And all we have to do is trust, and things will work out for us. So totally different understanding, totally different message than that first section. So here's an example. This is the passage that we're going to look at next week. This is chapter 40, right at the beginning of the transition from the old to the new. Comfort, oh comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So totally different tone than that last one I read to you, right? Totally different message. So this is why I feel, and many scholars believe, that this is not just one guy. This is multiple guys for multiple times and places. But again, if you're not at that place, totally fine with me. So anything about this one before we move on? All right. This is the last one. So the next thing that happens, what did I do? Oh, I didn't change this top part. This was supposed to say King Cyrus of Persia comes in and he conquers the Babylonians. So we had the Assyrians first. They were up there to the north. Then the Babylonians came in and conquered them, and then they conquered Judah. Then we have the Persians come in. They conquer everybody, and they've got control of all that northern area, including the area there along the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, where the Israelites were originally from. So King Cyrus of Persia comes in, and King Cyrus has a very different understanding of how to politically control his empire. So he decides that he is going to let the remaining people go back home. He says, in an edict, he says, everybody can go back to where they came from if they want to. Not everybody chooses to do that. Some people have established themselves. The exile started in 587, and this is 539. So, think about how much time that is. Who here, how much time is that? It's like 50 years. Who here has been in Reading for 50 years but wasn't born here? Anybody? Yeah. So are you ready to just pick up and go back where you came from because you're allowed to do that? No. Because you've got a life, right? You've got friends, you've got a house, you've got a job, you've got everything that's going on in your life, you've got everything established. So not everybody did this, but some people did. And so in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and some others, we have the story of the people returning to their homeland, reestablishing themselves, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple, and making sure that they can, they can kind of resume as much as possible the life that they used to live. Now they're still under the control of Persia. They're not free, but at least they get to live in their land that God gave them, worship in the way that God demands that they worship, and start reestablishing some of the cultural or the political understanding of what it means to be Jewish, not just cultural. Zoroastrianism. Yes, they actually were really into fortune telling. Zoroastrians are where we get like the astrology people that look in the stars and tell us what's going to happen to us tomorrow based on when we were born. All that kind of stuff comes from there.
The wise men who visit Jesus, the
Yeah.
magi, magicians, or probably Zoroastrians, Persia.
So this period took place between 539 with the Edict of Cyrus to approximately 400-ish. The temple was rebuilt between the years 520 and 515. So now, again, we're in a whole new circumstance. We're not in exile anymore. We're reestablishing ourselves. We've got hope for the future. We've got a reestablishment of the temple cult and all the responsibilities that come along with that. So again, we're going to expect to have a new message. And so now we get into 3rd Isaiah, which runs from chapters 55 to 66. And in this section, we have new themes. We have themes about returning to the land, rebuilding the temple. There are swings between intense judgment and intense hope. Hey, remember what happened before. Let's not screw this up again, despite the fact that we know that we keep screwing it up over and over and over and over. Let this time be the time that we're not going to screw it up. Spoiler alert, they screwed it up, obviously, just like we always do. But there's also intense hope. Just because we screwed it up before doesn't mean that God has abandoned us, right? Because now look at us, we're back. And so there's still hope for the future now and the future, in the distant future. So example from this section comes from Isaiah 58. This is my favorite passage in all of the Old Testament. And I had to take out a couple of places because already this is probably too small for you to read. Shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Announce to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their sins. Yet day after day they seek me and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that practiced righteousness and did not forsake the ordinance of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Why do we fast, but you do not see? Why humble ourselves, but you do not notice? Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is not this the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and to break every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them and not to hide yourself from your own kin. Then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer. You shall cry for help, and he will say, here I am. So they're reestablishing worship. They're reestablishing that relationship with God. They think that what makes them right in the eyes of God is doing all those right things in the temple. They think that their fast days, that their worship services are what does it. But now they're being reminded, hey, that was not the problem to begin with. The problem was that you were treating your people poorly. The problem was that there was internal economic and social unrest because there was this big gap, this big disparity between the courtiers and the king and all the other people who were suffering and struggling to survive because taxes were too high or because you were treating them poorly and not giving them enough land to work with, or whatever it was. Remember why it is that God gave you this land in the first place, to be a blessing to others internally and externally, and be those people. Don't worry so much about whether you light the right candles or sacrifice the right goat. Worry more about the fact that there are hungry people in your community. That's what matters to God. So that makes sense, right? In the context, if you're establishing yourself and figuring out what's important again, then this message is important to hear. again, we didn't really listen to it, right? But it's still given. And some people try to listen, of course. Otherwise, it's not in our Bible. So questions, comments about 3rd Isaiah?
Isn't it true that most of the Bible, the sections of the Bible that are not necessarily all written by one?
Yes, that is true. That can be a whole other class on another day. Joan's just given us our curriculum for the spring here. Yes, generally speaking, there is an understanding nowadays that the Bible, the Bible did not fall out of the sky, all, packed neatly in the King James Version. And it took a long time with a lot of different people. There would have been maybe scraps here and there as people started to write things down, because of course, for a long time, we didn't really write things down. It was all passed along by word of mouth, oral transmission, and then people started making notes of things and writing some things, and then maybe some other people gathered up some of those notes and kind of put them into a story that was cohesive, and then another person came along and took that and put it into a larger work, and slowly over time some of these works came into being, according to scholars. Others were written all at once, either using other outside sources or none, but a lot of it, they say that's especially the Old Testament, a lot of it has to do with that slow development of these traditions. So if you want to think more, or you just automatically decide that you want to buy into this because you believe Katie Swartz for some reason, it's not that these were completely different guys. Why would it all have fallen into the same book? I think that we can understand this as the Isaiah school, the Isaiah tradition, that, if there's this guy named Isaiah who said all these things and had this understanding of how you interpret the world and how you look at what's going on and how you focus on what it is that God is doing in this moment, then over the course of the next several hundred years, there would have been people who learned from that and kind of took the same tactics on how it is that they look at their new context. So 50 years later, 200 years later, we're still using the same tools as Isaiah, but we're looking at a whole new situation. And so how do we use Isaiah's tools to interpret our world right now? And so then, because that is true, then we can do the same thing. We can learn from that, and we can say, well, if we can kind of, reverse engineer this, what are some of those tools that are used? And then how can we apply those tools for ourselves? And that's what we're going to talk about over the course of the next 3 weeks. Anything else? All right. Well, just to kind of do a little summary before we run out of here, we've got these cycles of sin and judgment and restoration that mirrors the judge's cycle and mirrors even what's happening to us today if we have the eyes to see it. We have the theme of overturning oppressive social orders. The oppressor is about to fall. If we're in a situation where we're being oppressed, then that brings comfort to us. If we are being the oppressor, like in the last reading that I read to us, then that, of course, is supposed to wake us up and say, hey, we need to change our behavior. God's sovereignty, God is in control of everything, and therefore we have hope even in the face of difficult circumstances. And then asking the question, how do I understand my current circumstances in light of my understanding of who God is and who I am, so that I get to participate in the fulfillment of God's will in the world? God's will. There we go. My will be done. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Sorry I did a lot of talking this week. You'll get to do more next week when we take a look at Comfort, O comfort my people, in Isaiah 40. Thank you.